The airplane door sealed shut with a heavy thunk, and Sarah Chen's heart dropped into her stomach. Through the small window, she watched the ground crew pull away the jetway. Something felt terribly wrong. The seats around her were filled with passengers speaking rapid French, and the safety announcement crackling through the speakers was definitely not in English. She grabbed her boarding pass with trembling fingers and stared at the letters printed across the top. CDG to NCE. Charles de Gaulle to Nice. But she was supposed to be going to Newark. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she had done. She had boarded the completely wrong flight. And sitting just 3 rows ahead of her, in a seat that should have been in first class, was a man whose face she recognized from magazine covers and news broadcasts. James Montgomery, the billionaire tech genius worth over $40 billion, was flying economy class under a baseball cap, and he was traveling with a young girl who looked exactly like him. A girl the whole world believed didn't exist. Sarah's mouth went dry as the man turned slightly, and their eyes met for just a second. His expression changed from casual to alert in an instant, like a switch had been flipped. He knew that she had seen him. He knew that she recognized him. And now, trapped together at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, Sarah realized she had stumbled onto a secret that someone very powerful had worked very hard to keep hidden. 3 days earlier, Sarah Chun had been living the most ordinary life imaginable in her small apartment in Brooklyn. She was 28 years old, worked as a freelance graphic designer, and her biggest problem had been whether she could afford to fix her laptop or if she needed to buy a new one. Money was always tight, clients were hard to find, and her dream of starting her own design studio seemed further away with each passing month. But then her grandmother had gotten sick in Paris, and everything changed. Her mother had called at 2 in the morning, voice cracking with worry, saying that Grandma Louise had been hospitalized with pneumonia and the doctors weren't sure she would make it through the week. Sarah had booked the first flight she could afford, maxing out her credit card for a round-trip ticket to Paris. She had packed in a frenzy, thrown clothes into a suitcase without really looking at what she grabbed, and taken a taxi to JFK Airport with barely enough time to make her flight. The Paris trip had been a blur of hospital rooms and worried family members gathered around Grandma Louise's bedside. But her grandmother was a fighter, and after 4 days of antibiotics and rest, the doctors said she was going to recover fully. Sarah's mother and aunt would stay in Paris for another week, but Sarah had to get back to New York. She had client deadlines waiting, bills to pay, and a cat named Pickles who was probably driving her neighbor crazy by now. She had changed her return flight to leave a day early, and that's where everything had started to go wrong. The email confirmation had come through in French, which Sarah couldn't read very well, but she had assumed it was just a standard booking confirmation. She had been exhausted from days of sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs and running on nothing but coffee and anxiety. When she arrived at Charles de Gaulle Airport, she had been operating on autopilot, following signs and checking her phone for the gate number. We share powerful stories that uncover hidden truths and challenge perspectives. Subscribe to stay updated, share to keep others safe, and comment where you're watching from. Gate 42F had been printed on her boarding pass, and she had walked through the massive airport in a daze, barely paying attention to the signs around her. When she reached a gate with 42F displayed above it, she had simply gotten in line with the other passengers. No one had checked her boarding pass closely at the gate. The airline worker had just scanned it quickly and waved her through. Sarah had been one of the last passengers to board, rushing down the jetway with her carry-on bag bumping against her leg. She had found her seat, 32B, and collapsed into it with relief. She had been so tired that she hadn't even noticed the passengers around her speaking French. She had just closed her eyes and prepared for the long flight home. But then the flight attendant had made an announcement in French, followed by English with a heavy accent, welcoming everyone to the flight to Nice. Sarah's eyes had snapped open. Nice? She was supposed to be going to Newark. She had fumbled for her boarding pass and stared at it in growing horror. The code CDG to NCE was printed clearly across the top. She had somehow boarded a domestic French flight instead of her international flight back to New York. Her actual flight to Newark must have been leaving from a different gate, probably at the exact same time. Her hands had started shaking as panic set in. She had to get off this plane. She had pressed the call button frantically, and when the flight attendant came over, Sarah had tried to explain in rushed, desperate English that she was on the wrong flight. But the flight attendant had simply smiled apologetically and said that the doors were already sealed and they were preparing for takeoff. There was nothing that could be done now. Sarah would have to fly to Nice and then figure out how to get back to Paris and catch another flight to New York. The flight attendant had been kind but firm, and Sarah had sunk back into her seat feeling like the biggest idiot in the world. How could she have been so careless? How could she have not noticed she was boarding the wrong plane? The answer was simple. She had been exhausted and worried and not paying attention, and now she was going to end up in the south of France instead of New York City, and she had no idea how much it would cost to fix this mess. Her credit card was already maxed out. She didn't have money for another flight. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, and there was nothing she could do but sit there and feel terrible about it. That's when she had noticed the man 3 rows ahead. He was sitting in an aisle seat, and there was something familiar about the way he held himself, even though he was clearly trying to look inconspicuous. He wore a plain baseball cap pulled low over his face, a wrinkled t-shirt, and jeans that looked like they came from a regular store. Nothing about his appearance screamed wealth or fame, but Sarah had always been good with faces. It was part of her job as a designer to notice details, to remember the shapes and lines that made each person unique. And as the man shifted in his seat and tilted his head slightly to look out the window, Sarah's breath caught in recognition. James Montgomery. It had to be him. She had just read an article about him 2 weeks ago in a business magazine at her dentist's office. James Montgomery, founder and CEO of TechVision Industries, the company that had revolutionized cloud computing and artificial intelligence. He was one of the richest men in the world, worth somewhere around $40 billion according to the latest Forbes list. He lived in a massive estate in Silicon Valley, owned properties in 6 different countries, and was famous for being intensely private despite his public business success. He never gave personal interviews. He never attended celebrity events. He kept his private life completely separate from his business empire. And he was definitely, absolutely supposed to be traveling in private jets, not in seat 23C of an economy flight from Paris to Nice. Sarah had stared at him, trying to convince herself she was wrong. Maybe it was just someone who looked like James Montgomery. Maybe exhaustion was making her see things. But then the little girl sitting next to him had shifted in her seat, and Sarah got a clear view of her face. The girl looked about 9 or 10 years old, with the same sharp cheekbones as the man beside her, the same distinctive nose, the same deep-set eyes. She was reading a book, completely absorbed in it, occasionally reaching up to push her dark hair behind her ear in a gesture that exactly mirrored the way the man beside her moved. The resemblance was striking. This had to be his daughter. But James Montgomery didn't have a daughter. Sarah was sure of that. The articles about him always mentioned that he was unmarried and had no children. His private life was a mystery, but everyone agreed on that one fact. He was alone. He devoted himself entirely to his work. So who was this girl? Sarah had felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what she might be looking at. A hidden child. A secret daughter that the billionaire had kept away from the public eye. But why? Why would someone go to such lengths to hide a child's existence? And why was James Montgomery flying economy class on a random domestic French flight with this mysterious girl? Nothing about the situation made sense, and yet here it was happening right in front of her eyes. She had torn her gaze away, heart pounding, trying to act casual. She didn't want to stare. She didn't want to draw attention to herself. But her mind was racing with questions. This was huge. This was the kind of secret that tabloids would pay enormous amounts of money to expose. Not that Sarah would ever do that, but the fact remained that she had stumbled onto something big. The plane had started moving then, backing away from the gate and taxiing toward the runway. Sarah had gripped the armrests, her earlier panic about being on the wrong flight now mixed with a completely different kind of anxiety. What was she supposed to do with this information? Should she pretend she hadn't seen anything? Should she try to talk to him? The logical part of her brain said to just mind her own business and forget about it. But the curious part of her brain, the part that had always gotten her into trouble, wanted to know more. Who was this girl? Why was she a secret? And what would a billionaire do if he realized someone had discovered his hidden child? As the plane lifted off the runway and climbed into the gray Paris sky, Sarah had caught James Montgomery's eye again in that brief moment when he turned to check on the girl beside him. And in that split second of eye contact, something had passed between them. Recognition, understanding, fear. He knew that she knew. His expression had shifted so quickly that someone else might have missed it, but Sarah had seen it clearly. The casual, relaxed demeanor disappeared, replaced by something harder, more alert. His jaw had tightened. His eyes had narrowed just slightly, and then he had turned back around, but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders now, the way he sat just a little bit straighter, more ready. Sarah had looked away quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. She felt like she had just walked into a situation way over her head. This was supposed to be a simple flight home after visiting her sick grandmother. How had it turned into whatever this was? She had pulled out her phone, desperate for the distraction, but they were still climbing and the flight attendant was announcing that all electronic devices needed to be in airplane mode. Sarah had switched her phone off completely and shoved it back in her bag. She was trapped here for the next hour and a half, sitting just a few rows behind a man who clearly did not want to be seen or recognized, with a secret that could potentially explode into a massive scandal. The flight had settled into its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign had dinged off. Passengers around Sarah had started shifting in their seats, some pulling out books or tablets, others closing their eyes for a nap. But Sarah couldn't relax. She kept glancing at the back of James Montgomery's head, watching as he leaned over to help the girl with something, their heads close together in the intimate way that parents and children naturally moved around each other. There was clear affection there. This wasn't some bizarre kidnapping situation. This was a father and daughter hiding in plain sight. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the girl's mother had been someone Montgomery wanted to keep secret. Maybe there was a custody battle he was trying to avoid. Maybe he was protecting the girl from the media attention that would inevitably come if the world knew that James Montgomery had a child. Rich people did strange things to protect their privacy. She knew that. But flying economy class seemed extreme, even for someone trying to stay under the radar. Why not just use a private jet if you wanted to travel secretly? Why risk being seen by regular people on a commercial flight? Unless, Sarah thought with a sudden flash of insight, he was running from something. Or someone. What if this wasn't just about privacy? What if there was actual danger involved? Before she could stop herself, Sarah found herself standing up and moving down the aisle toward the bathroom at the front of the plane. She told herself she just needed to splash some water on her face and calm down. But as she walked past row 23, she couldn't help but glance down. The little girl was still absorbed in her book, but James Montgomery's head turned slightly, tracking Sarah's movement. Their eyes met again, and this time he didn't look away. He studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and Sarah felt like she was being evaluated, assessed for threat level. Then his hand moved, just slightly, reaching into the seat pocket in front of him. When he pulled it back out, Sarah caught the glint of something metallic tucked against his palm. Her breath stopped. Was that a weapon? Her feet kept moving on autopilot, carrying her past his row and into the tiny airplane bathroom. She locked the door behind her with shaking hands and gripped the edge of the sink, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Sarah splashed cold water on her face, watching the drops slide down her cheeks and drip into the tiny sink. Her reflection stared back at her with wide, frightened eyes. What had she just seen? Was James Montgomery actually carrying some kind of weapon on this plane? Or had her imagination run wild, turning an innocent glimpse of metal into something dangerous? She dried her face with the rough paper towels and tried to slow her breathing. She needed to think clearly. She needed to calm down. Panicking wouldn't help anything. But her hands were still shaking as she unlocked the bathroom door and stepped back into the narrow aisle. The walk back to her seat felt like the longest journey of her life. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the worn carpet beneath her feet, trying not to look at James Montgomery as she passed his row. But she could feel his gaze on her, tracking her movement like a hawk watching a mouse. When she finally slid back into seat 32B, She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The older French woman in the window seat beside her smiled politely and went back to her crossword puzzle, completely unaware of the tension crackling through Sarah's body. Sarah pulled out her tablet and pretended to read a book, but the words blurred together on the screen. Her mind kept circling back to the same questions over and over. Who was that little girl? Why was she a secret? And what would happen when they landed in Nice? Would James Montgomery simply disappear into the crowd with his daughter, and Sarah would never know the truth? Or would something else happen? Something she couldn't predict? She thought about the metallic glint she had seen in his hand. Maybe it had just been a phone case. Maybe it had been a piece of gum wrapper catching the light. Maybe she was being ridiculous and paranoid. But the look in his eyes had been real. The warning in that gaze had been clear. He knew she had seen him, and he was not happy about it. 20 minutes passed in tense silence. Sarah tried to focus on her book, on the low hum of the airplane engines, on anything except the man 3 rows ahead. But then the little girl stood up and walked past Sarah's row toward the bathroom. Sarah watched her go, noticing details she hadn't seen before. The girl wore expensive sneakers, the kind that cost $200 in stores. Her jeans had a designer label stitched on the pocket. But her t-shirt looked old and worn, like something bought at a thrift store. It was a strange combination, luxury mixed with ordinary, as if someone had tried to make her look less wealthy but hadn't quite succeeded. When the girl returned from the bathroom a few minutes later, she paused beside Sarah's row. The older French woman had gotten up to stretch her legs, leaving the aisle seat empty. The girl looked at Sarah with curious dark eyes, the same intelligent gaze her father had. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but there was something sharp and aware in her expression, something that seemed older than her years. Sarah managed a small smile, not sure what else to do. The girl smiled back, and then to Sarah's complete surprise, she spoke in perfect English with an American accent. "Are you okay? You look kind of nervous." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I'm fine," she managed to say, though her voice came out shakier than she intended. "Just not a great flyer." The girl nodded sympathetically. "I used to be scared of flying too. My dad taught me to count backwards from 100 whenever I feel nervous. It helps distract your brain." She tilted her head slightly, studying Sarah with that unervingly perceptive gaze. "Is this your first time in France?" "No, I was visiting my grandmother," Sarah said, relaxing slightly despite herself. There was something genuinely kind about this girl, something that made it hard to stay frightened. "She was sick, but she's better now. I'm actually supposed to be flying to New York, but I got on the wrong plane by mistake." The girl's eyes widened with sympathy. "Oh no, that's terrible. What are you going to do?" Sarah shrugged helplessly. "I guess I'll figure it out when we land in Nice. Maybe I can get a flight back to Paris and then home." She paused, then added carefully, "Are you traveling with your family?" The girl's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "I'm with my dad," she said quietly, gesturing back toward where James Montgomery sat. Sarah could see him watching them intently, his body language radiating tension. "We're on vacation." "That sounds nice," Sarah said, keeping her voice casual even though her heart was pounding. "Nice is supposed to be beautiful." "Yeah," the girl agreed, but there was something sad in her voice, something that didn't match the idea of a happy vacation. Before Sarah could say anything else, James Montgomery appeared in the aisle beside his daughter. Up close, he was even more imposing than Sarah had expected. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of presence that filled a space. Despite his casual clothes and baseball cap, there was no mistaking the authority in his stance, the power in the way he moved. "Emma," he said quietly, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "Come back to your seat." His eyes met Sarah's, and there was a clear warning in them. A message that said, "Back off. Mind your own business. This doesn't concern you." Emma looked up at her father, then back at Sarah. "It was nice talking to you," she said politely. "I hope you figure out your flight situation." "Thank you," Sarah managed to say. She watched as James Montgomery guided his daughter back to their row. his hand protective on her shoulder. Emma, Sarah thought. So that was her name. She filed the information away, along with everything else she had observed. The expensive shoes, the old t-shirt, the sadness in Emma's voice when she talked about their vacation, the way James Montgomery watched over her like she was the most precious thing in the world. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of anxious thoughts. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the brief conversation, about the look in James Montgomery's eyes when he had come to collect his daughter. There was fear there, she realized. Not just anger at being recognized, but genuine fear. He was protecting Emma from something, and whatever it was serious enough to make one of the most powerful men in the world fly economy class and hide in plain sight. When the pilot announced their descent into Nice, Sarah's stomach knotted with fresh anxiety. What would happen when they landed? Would James Montgomery simply disappear with Emma into the crowds of the airport? Would Sarah ever learn the truth about who this girl was and why she had been kept secret? The plane touched down with a slight bump, and passengers around her began gathering their belongings. Sarah pulled her carry-on from the overhead bin and joined the slow shuffle toward the exit. 3 rows ahead, she could see James Montgomery helping Emma with her small backpack. They moved together toward the door, and Sarah found herself following at a distance, unable to stop herself from wanting to know more. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps us motivated and reminds us that our stories are making a difference in people's lives. They exited into the terminal, and Sarah watched as James Montgomery pulled Emma close, scanning the crowd with alert, cautious eyes. Then he started walking quickly toward the exit, Emma struggling to keep up with his long strides. Sarah followed, maintaining her distance but keeping them in sight. She told herself she was just heading in the same direction, that she needed to find information about flights back to Paris anyway. But the truth was, she couldn't let this go. Something was very wrong here, and every instinct she had was telling her that Emma needed help, even if Sarah didn't understand why yet. They were passing through the baggage claim area when it happened. 3 men in dark suits appeared seemingly out of nowhere, blocking James Montgomery's path. Sarah froze, watching from 20 feet away as the scene unfolded. The men weren't airport security. They moved with practiced coordination, forming a triangle that trapped James and Emma against a wall. One of them spoke in low, urgent tones that Sarah couldn't hear, but she could see James Montgomery's face, and the expression there made her blood run cold. It was pure terror. James Montgomery's hand tightened protectively around Emma's shoulder, pulling her behind him as he faced the 3 men in dark suits. Sarah stood frozen near a baggage carousel, her carry-on bag hanging forgotten from her hand. She should walk away. She should find the information desk and deal with her own problems. But her feet wouldn't move. Something about the way those men had appeared, the way they had cornered James and Emma with such precision, sent alarm bells ringing through her head. This wasn't a friendly encounter. This was a confrontation, and it was happening right here in the middle of a busy airport where hundreds of travelers rushed past, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding against the wall. The man in the center of the group was tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut military short. He spoke to James in a voice too quiet for Sarah to hear over the airport noise, but she could read the body language clearly enough. This was a threat. The other 2 men flanked him, their hands resting casually near their jacket pockets in a way that made Sarah think of weapons. Her mouth went dry. Were these men police, private security, or something worse? James was speaking now, his voice also too low to hear, but his face had gone pale under the baseball cap. Emma pressed against his back, peeking around his side with frightened eyes. Sarah's hand moved to her phone in her pocket. Should she call security? But what would she say? She didn't actually know what was happening here. Maybe these men had a legitimate reason for stopping James Montgomery. Maybe this was some kind of business dispute or legal matter that Sarah didn't understand. But then Emma made a small sound, something between a whimper and a gasp, and the silver-haired man took a step closer to James with his hand moving toward his jacket. That decided it for Sarah. Whatever was happening here, that little girl was scared, and Sarah couldn't just walk away from a frightened child. Before she could second-guess herself, Sarah was moving. She walked quickly toward the group, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had no plan, no idea what she was going to do when she got there, but her legs carried her forward anyway. As she approached, she raised her phone and started speaking in a loud, cheerful voice that she hoped sounded natural. "There you are. I've been looking everywhere for you," Sarah called out, waving her phone like she was thrilled to have found lost friends. The three men in suits turned to look at her with identical expressions of cold assessment. James Montgomery's eyes widened in surprise and something that might have been warning. But Sarah kept walking until she was right beside him, inserting herself into the tense circle with false brightness. "The luggage took forever to come out, didn't it? I thought we'd miss our ride." She looked directly at the silver-haired man and gave him her best confused smile. "Oh, I'm sorry. Are these friends of yours?" The silver-haired man studied Sarah with the kind of gaze that seemed to catalog every detail about her. She felt stripped bare under that look, like he could see through her terrible acting and her racing pulse and knew exactly what she was trying to do. But she held her ground, keeping the polite smile plastered on her face even though her legs felt like they might give out. After a moment that stretched like taffy, the man spoke in accented English. "We have business with Mr. Montgomery. Private business. Perhaps you should find your own transportation." "Oh, but we're sharing a ride," Sarah said, the lie tumbling out of her mouth before she could think about it. "We met on the plane and realized we were both heading to the same hotel, so we decided to split a taxi. Makes sense, right? Everything's so expensive these days." She laughed, a high-pitched sound that didn't sound convincing even to her own ears. She turned to James, praying he would play along. "Isn't that right? We talked about it on the flight." For a long moment, James Montgomery just stared at her. Sarah could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, weighing options, assessing risks. Then, to her enormous relief, he nodded slowly. "That's right," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "We should probably get going. Our driver is waiting." He shifted slightly, keeping Emma behind him, and took a small step toward the exit. The three men didn't move to let him pass. The silver-haired man's expression hardened. "I don't think you understand the situation, Mr. Montgomery. We need to have a conversation now. And your new friend here should leave before she finds herself involved in matters that don't concern her." The threat in his words was crystal clear, and Sarah felt ice run down her spine. But she also saw Emma's small hand clutching the back of James's shirt, and she thought about what her grandmother had always told her. Good people don't walk away when someone needs help. Good people stand up even when they're scared. "Actually," Sarah said, surprised by how firm her voice sounded, "I'm pretty concerned about having a shared taxi. I already paid half the fare in advance. So if there's business you need to discuss, maybe you could schedule a meeting for later? We really do need to get going." She pulled out her phone again and held it up like she was checking the time. "Our driver said he'd only wait 15 minutes. The standoff stretched for several heartbeats. Sarah could feel sweat gathering at the small of her back despite the air-conditioned terminal. The three men exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then the silver-haired man smiled, and it was one of the coldest expressions Sarah had ever seen. It didn't reach his eyes at all. "Of course," he said smoothly. "We wouldn't want to make you late. But Mr. Montgomery, we will be seeing you again. Very soon. You can't hide forever, and you know what we want." He reached into his jacket pocket, and Sarah's breath caught, but he only pulled out a business card. He held it out to James, who took it reluctantly. "Call me by tomorrow, or the next conversation won't be so polite." With that, the three men turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of travelers as quickly as they had appeared. Sarah stood there for a moment, her entire body shaking with adrenaline, watching them go. Had that really just happened? Had she really just inserted herself into whatever dangerous situation James Montgomery was running from? Beside her, James let out a long breath and pulled Emma around to face him, checking her over with urgent hands. "Are you okay, sweetheart? Did they hurt you?" "I'm fine, Dad," Emma said, but her voice was small and frightened. "Who were those men?" Nobody you need to worry about, James said, though the tremor in his voice suggested he was plenty worried himself. Then he turned to Sarah, and his expression was complicated. A mix of gratitude and anger and confusion. What the hell did you just do? Sarah's knees felt weak. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the reality of what she'd done was hitting her. She had just confronted what were clearly dangerous men, had inserted herself into a situation she didn't understand, and had tied herself to James Montgomery and his mysterious daughter in a way she couldn't take back. I don't know, she admitted honestly. I saw Emma was scared, and I just reacted. I'm sorry if I made things worse. James stared at her for another long moment, then ran a hand over his face, pushing the baseball cap back slightly. You didn't make things worse, he said quietly. You might have just saved our lives. Those men wouldn't have done anything violent in front of a witness who could identify them later. He glanced around the terminal nervously, as if expecting the suited men to reappear. But we need to get out of here, now, and you need to come with us. What? Sarah's eyes widened. Why do I need to come with you? Because you just made yourself a witness? James said grimly, already starting to walk toward the exit with Emma's hand firmly in his. Because those men saw you with us, and they're going to wonder who you are and what you know. Because whether you meant to or not, you just painted a target on your back. He looked over his shoulder at her, and his expression was deadly serious. So unless you want to find out what those men do to loose ends, I suggest you stick close. At least until I can figure out how to keep you safe. Sarah's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. An hour ago, her biggest problem had been getting on the wrong flight. Now she was apparently in danger from mysterious men in suits who had threatened a billionaire in the middle of an airport. But as she looked at Emma's frightened face and thought about those cold eyes studying her, she realized James was probably right. She had inserted herself into the situation, and now she was part of it whether she liked it or not. With shaking legs, she grabbed her carry-on bag and hurried after James and Emma. They pushed through the airport exit doors into the bright French sunshine, and Sarah had no idea what would happen next. All she knew was that her life had just taken a turn into something dangerous and strange, and there was no going back now. The Mediterranean sun was blinding after the dim airport terminal, and Sarah squinted against the glare as she followed James and Emma through the crowded pickup area. Taxis honked, buses rumbled past belching diesel fumes, and tourists shouted to each other in a dozen different languages. James moved quickly, scanning the area with sharp, alert eyes while keeping Emma close to his side. Sarah struggled to keep up, her carry-on bag bumping against her leg with every step. Her mind was still trying to process what had just happened inside the terminal. Those men had been real. The threat had been real. And now she was running through a French airport with a billionaire and his secret daughter, fleeing from danger she didn't understand. James led them past the taxi line and the rental car shuttles, heading toward the far end of the pickup area where fewer people congregated. Finally, he stopped beside a plain gray sedan that looked at least 10 years old. The paint was faded, and there was a dent in the rear bumper. It was exactly the kind of unremarkable car that nobody would look at twice. James pulled out a key fob and unlocked it, then quickly ushered Emma into the back seat. He looked at Sarah, who stood there uncertainly with her bag. Get in, he said urgently. We need to move. Those men could have people watching the exits. Sarah's survival instincts warred with her common sense. Getting into a car with a stranger was exactly what every safety lesson had warned her against. But then she remembered the cold smile on the silver-haired man's face, the way his hand had moved toward his jacket, and she made her decision. She threw her bag in the trunk and slid into the passenger seat. James was already behind the wheel, starting the engine before Sarah had even closed her door. They pulled away from the curb smoothly, merging into the flow of traffic leaving the airport. Nobody spoke for several minutes. James kept checking the rearview mirror, his jaw tight with tension. Emma sat quietly in the back seat, her earlier fear replaced by a kind of weary resignation that seemed far too adult for a child her age. Sarah watched the unfamiliar French landscape roll past the windows, her thoughts spinning in dizzy circles. What had she gotten herself into? Who were those men? And why was James Montgomery, one of the richest people in the world, driving a beat-up sedan through the south of France like he was in some kind of spy movie? Finally, when they had been driving for almost 20 minutes and the airport was far behind them, Sarah found her voice. "Okay," she said, turning to look at James. "I think you owe me an explanation. Who were those men? And why are they after you and Emma?" James's hands tightened on the steering wheel. For a moment Sarah thought he wasn't going to answer, but then he let out a long breath. "It's complicated," he said quietly. "I just confronted 3 dangerous men and possibly put myself in danger to help you." Sarah shot back, her fear turning into anger now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "I think I deserve more than it's complicated. I don't even know if I should be in this car right now. For all I know, you're the dangerous one and those men were trying to help Emma." That got a reaction. James's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing. "I would never hurt Emma. She's my daughter, and I'm trying to protect her." "From what?" Sarah demanded. "And if she's your daughter, why doesn't anyone know she exists? I've read articles about you. Everyone says you don't have children." "Because I wanted to keep her safe," James said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "Because I knew that if the wrong people found out about her, they would try to use her to get to me. And I was right." He gestured vaguely back toward the airport. "Those men work for Viktor Kozlov. He's a Russian oligarch who I had business dealings with years ago. Things went bad. He lost money because of decisions I made. A lot of money. And now he wants revenge." Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together the story. "So he's threatening Emma to get back at you?" "It's more than threats," James said grimly. 6 months ago, someone tried to kidnap her from her school in California. We barely got her out in time. That's when I realized we couldn't stay in the States anymore. Kozlov has too many connections there, too many resources. So I've been moving Emma around Europe, trying to stay ahead of his people while I figure out a permanent solution." He glanced in the rearview mirror at his daughter, and his expression softened with love and pain. "I never wanted this life for her. I wanted her to have a normal childhood, go to normal schools, have friends. But instead she's been living like a fugitive for half a year." Emma spoke up from the back seat, her voice small. "It's not your fault, Dad. You're keeping me safe. That's what matters." Sarah felt her heart twist. This poor child had been uprooted from her entire life, forced to hide and run because of her father's business enemies. It was terrible and unfair, and Sarah understood now why James had looked so frightened in the airport. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting the person he loved most in the world. But something still didn't make sense. "If you're trying to stay hidden," Sarah asked, "why were you on a commercial flight? Why not use a private jet or something?" James laughed bitterly. "Because Kozlov's people monitor private airfields. They track flight manifests for private jets registered to me or any of my companies. Flying commercial, especially on random short flights within Europe, makes us harder to track. We buy tickets with cash at the last minute, use fake names, dress down so we don't attract attention. It's worked for 6 months." He paused, then added quietly, "Until today. How did they find you?" "I don't know," James admitted, and Sarah could hear the frustration and fear in his voice. "We were so careful. We've been staying in a small village in the French countryside. Nowhere near anywhere I have business connections. I have no idea how they tracked us to that airport." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Unless they've been watching multiple airports, waiting for us to show up, that would take significant resources, but Kozlov has those." Sarah digested this information, staring out at the passing scenery. They had left the highway now and were driving through countryside, past vineyards and small stone houses with red tile roofs. It was beautiful, peaceful, completely at odds with the danger they were apparently fleeing. She thought about her own life back in Brooklyn, her small apartment and her freelance design work and her cat Pickles. That world seemed impossibly far away now, like something from a dream. How had she gone from accidentally boarding the wrong flight to being caught up in an international chase involving oligarchs and kidnapping attempts? "Where are we going now?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," James said vaguely. "A place Kozlov doesn't know about. At least, I hope he doesn't know about it. He glanced at Sarah, and his expression was apologetic. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. You were just trying to help, and now you're at risk too. Those men saw you with us. They'll try to identify you, figure out who you are and what your connection to me might be. Great, Sarah muttered. That's just great. I'll get you out of France safely, James promised. I'll make sure you get home to New York, and I'll arrange protection for you until we can confirm that Kozlov's people aren't interested in you. It's the least I can do after what you did back there. Sarah wanted to feel reassured, but instead she just felt exhausted and overwhelmed. She glanced back at Emma, who was staring out the window with a sad, distant expression. What kind of life was this for a child? Always running, always hiding, never able to put down roots or make real friends. And now Sarah was part of this mess too, whether she wanted to be or not. They drove for another hour through increasingly rural areas. The roads became narrower, the houses fewer and farther between. Finally, James turned down a dirt road that wound through an olive grove. At the end of the road sat a small stone farmhouse, partially hidden by overgrown trees and wild bushes. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time. James parked behind the house where the car wouldn't be visible from the road, and killed the engine. We'll stay here tonight, he said quietly. Rest, make a plan. Then tomorrow we figure out how to get you home and get Emma somewhere Kozlov can't find her. He turned to look at Sarah with serious eyes. I know you have questions. I know you're scared. But I need you to trust me for a little bit longer. Can you do that? Sarah looked at the old farmhouse, then at Emma's tired face in the back seat, then at James's pleading expression. She thought about those men at the airport, about the fear in Emma's eyes, about the choice she had made to get involved. There was no going back now. She was in this for better or worse. So she took a deep breath and nodded. I can do that, she said. For now. They got out of the car, and Sarah grabbed her bag from the trunk. As they walked toward the farmhouse, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It should have been beautiful, peaceful. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that danger was creeping closer with every passing moment. And when James pulled out a key to unlock the farmhouse door, Sarah saw his hand was shaking. The inside of the farmhouse was dark and musty, smelling of old wood and lavender. James flipped a light switch, and a single bare bulb flickered to life overhead, casting long shadows across the sparsely furnished room. There was a worn couch against one wall, a small wooden table with mismatched chairs, and a kitchenette in the corner with appliances that looked like they belonged in a museum. Emma immediately went to the couch and curled up in the corner, pulling her knees to her chest. She looked so small and vulnerable sitting there, and Sarah felt a fresh wave of sympathy for the girl. James moved through the space with practiced efficiency, checking the windows and drawing the faded curtains closed. There's canned food in the pantry, he said without looking at Sarah. The water works, though it takes a minute to run clear. Bathroom is through that door. There are 2 bedrooms upstairs, basic beds but clean sheets. I stocked this place a few months ago as a backup safe house. He finally turned to face her, and his expression was exhausted. Make yourself comfortable. We're going to be here for a while. Sarah set her bag down and looked around the small space. It felt surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life, someone who lived in a world of secret safe houses and dangerous enemies. Just yesterday she had been sitting in a Paris hospital reading magazines in the waiting room while her grandmother slept. Now she was in a hidden farmhouse in the French countryside with a billionaire and his fugitive daughter. Life could change in the strangest ways. I should call my mother, Sarah said suddenly, pulling out her phone. She's still in Paris with my grandmother. She'll be worried when I don't call from New York. James crossed the room quickly and put his hand on her phone, gently pushing it down. Don't, he said urgently. Not yet. Kozlov's people are sophisticated. If they've identified you from the airport, they might already be monitoring your phone. Any call you make could be traced, could lead them right to us. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. You're being paranoid. How could they possibly identify me that fast? Facial recognition software, James said grimly. Airport security cameras. It wouldn't take more than a couple of hours for someone with the right resources and technology. And Kozlov has both. He released her phone and stepped back. I know it's hard. I know you want to tell your family you're safe. But right now, radio silence is the safest option for everyone. Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he was overreacting, but the memory of those cold eyes at the airport stopped her. Those men had not been amateurs. They had moved with precision and purpose like professionals who did this kind of thing regularly. Maybe James was right to be cautious. Maybe her phone really could lead danger straight to them. She slipped it back into her pocket, feeling more cut off from her normal life than ever. Emma spoke up from the couch, her voice quiet. Are you hungry? I could make something. There's probably pasta in the pantry. I'm a pretty good cook. She said it with a hint of pride, and Sarah realized that this girl had probably learned to be self-sufficient out of necessity. When you were constantly on the move, staying in safe houses and temporary locations, you learn to take care of yourself. That would be nice, Sarah said gently. Thank you, Emma. The girl smiled, a real smile that lit up her whole face, and Sarah saw what she must have been like before all this started. Before the kidnapping attempt and the running and the fear. Just a normal kid who liked cooking and probably liked reading, given the way she had been absorbed in her book on the plane. It broke Sarah's heart to think about what had been stolen from her. While Emma busied herself in the kitchenette, pulling out cans and a pot, James gestured for Sarah to follow him outside. They stepped through the back door into the overgrown garden behind the farmhouse. The sun had set completely now, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The air smelled like wild rosemary and dry earth. It should have been peaceful, but tension radiated from James like heat from a fire. I need to ask you something, he said quietly, keeping his voice low so Emma wouldn't hear through the open door. Back at the airport when you intervened, that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. I haven't decided which. But either way, you put yourself at risk for people you don't know. Why? Sarah thought about the question. Why had she done it? She could have walked away. Should have walked away. I saw Emma's face, she said finally. She was scared. And I guess I couldn't just stand there and watch a child be frightened without trying to help. She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. My grandmother always told me that good people don't look away when someone needs help. She lived through World War II in France. She was just a little girl, but she remembers neighbors who looked away when bad things happened, and neighbors who stood up even when it was dangerous. She taught me that looking away makes you part of the problem. James was quiet for a long moment, studying her in the fading light. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She is, Sarah said, feeling a pang of homesickness. She's tough as nails. Survived the war, survived immigrating to America, survived raising 3 kids on her own after my grandfather died. She's the strongest person I know. Emma's grandmother was like that too, James said softly. Emma's mother, Rachel, died when Emma was 3. Cancer. It was fast and brutal and unfair. Rachel's mother helped me raise Emma for a few years after that, taught her to be strong and kind and brave. But she passed away 2 years ago. His voice cracked slightly. Emma's lost so many people. Her mother, her grandmother, her friends from school when we had to run. She deserves better than this life I've given her. Sarah heard the guilt and pain in his voice, and she understood something fundamental about James Montgomery in that moment. He wasn't some cold businessman playing games with billions of dollars. He was a father who was terrified of losing his daughter, who was doing everything he could to keep her safe even if it meant living like fugitives. The article she had read about him had painted him as brilliant but distant, a genius more comfortable with technology than people. But standing here in the garden of a safe house, hearing the emotion in his voice when he talked about his daughter, she saw the truth. He was just a man trying to protect his child. You're doing your best, Sarah said. That's all any parent can do. My best isn't good enough, James said bitterly. If it was, we wouldn't be running. We wouldn't be hiding. Emma would be in school with friends, doing normal kid things, not learning how to spot surveillance and memorizing emergency evacuation plans. He ran a hand through his hair, knocking the baseball cap askew. I built a $40 billion company. I revolutionized cloud computing. I'm supposed to be one of the smartest people in the world, but I can't figure out how to keep my own daughter safe. Maybe you need help, Sarah suggested carefully. What about going to the authorities? The police, the FBI? Surely they could protect Emma from Kozlov. James laughed, but there was no humor in it. Kozlov has people everywhere. Police departments, government agencies, private security firms. He's been building his network for decades. The last time I tried to work with authorities, the information leaked within 48 hours. We barely escaped that time. He shook his head. No, the only way to keep Emma safe is to stay invisible, keep moving, and hope that eventually Kozlov loses interest or gets distracted by other enemies. It's not a great plan, but it's all I have. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds of the French countryside. Crickets chirped in the grass. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. It was so peaceful here, so far removed from the danger and chaos they were fleeing. Sarah found herself wondering what it would be like to just stay here, to hide away from the world in this forgotten farmhouse and pretend that threats and enemies didn't exist. But she knew that wasn't realistic. Eventually they would be found. Eventually they would have to move again. That seemed to be the pattern of James and Emma's life now, an endless cycle of running and hiding. What about Emma's education? Sarah asked. If you're constantly moving, how does she go to school? I homeschool her, James said. I was always good at math and science, so those subjects are easy. For everything else, we use online programs and I hire tutors when we stay somewhere long enough. She's actually ahead of where she should be for her age. Smart kid. Takes after her mother. Pride crept into his voice when he talked about Emma's intelligence. Rachel was a software engineer. Brilliant mind. We met at a tech conference and spent 6 hours debating the future of artificial intelligence. I knew I loved her before the night was over. Sarah smiled at the warmth in his voice. She sounds amazing. She was, James said quietly. I wish Emma had more time with her. I wish Rachel could see the person Emma's becoming. She'd be so proud. He cleared his throat, pushing emotion down. Anyway, we should go back inside. Emma's probably got dinner ready, and we need to eat and rest. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. They walked back into the farmhouse to find Emma stirring a pot of pasta on the ancient stove. She had found some canned tomatoes and herbs, and the smell was surprisingly good. She had even set the table with the mismatched plates and forks she had found in the cupboards. Sarah felt a rush of affection for this resilient girl who could make a home out of a temporary safe house, who could cook dinner in the middle of a crisis, who smiled even though her life had been turned upside down. They sat around the small table and ate together, and for a little while it felt almost normal. Emma told stories about a book she was reading, some fantasy adventure with dragons and magic. James asked Sarah about her design work, and she found herself talking about her favorite projects and her dreams of starting her own studio. Emma asked Sarah about New York, her eyes wide with curiosity, and Sarah described the city with its towering buildings and crowded streets and endless energy. For just a little while, they weren't fugitives and an accidental witness. They were just 3 people sharing a meal and conversation. But reality crept back in as dinner ended and Emma's eyes started to droop with exhaustion. James sent her upstairs to get ready for bed, and once she was gone, the weight of their situation settled back over the small farmhouse like a heavy blanket. James cleared the dishes while Sarah dried them with a faded towel, and neither of them spoke. Finally, when the kitchen was clean and Emma's soft footsteps had stopped moving around upstairs, James turned to Sarah with serious eyes. We need to talk about tomorrow, he said. I need to figure out how to get you out of France safely and back to your life. The longer you stay with us, the more danger you're in. But I also need to make sure Kozlov's people aren't watching you, waiting to see if you lead them to me. How do you plan to do that? Sarah asked. I have some contacts who can help, James said vaguely. People who owe me favors, who can check if your identity has been flagged in any databases, who can arrange safe transportation. But it's going to take time to set up, maybe a couple of days. He looked uncomfortable. Which means you're stuck here with us for at least that long. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you signed up for. Sarah thought about her apartment in Brooklyn, her clients waiting for design work, her poor cat being fed by her neighbor. She thought about her mother in Paris, probably starting to worry when Sarah didn't call. She thought about her normal, ordinary life that now seemed like something from a different universe. "It's okay," she said, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. "I made the choice to get involved. I'll deal with the consequences." James nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the business card that the silver-haired man had given him at the airport. He stared at it for a long moment, his expression troubled. He said to call by tomorrow, that the next conversation wouldn't be polite if I don't. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," James admitted. "Part of me wants to call to try to negotiate, to see if there's any way to end this without more running. But I know Kozlov. I know how he operates. He doesn't negotiate in good faith. He traps you and then destroys you." He tossed the card on the table like it was poisonous. "No, calling him would just give him more information about where we are and what resources we have. Better to stay silent and keep moving." Sarah wasn't sure she agreed, but this wasn't her decision to make. She was just an accidental participant in someone else's drama, trying to survive until she could get back to her own life. She excused herself and went upstairs to one of the bedrooms, where she found a narrow bed with clean white sheets and a single window looking out over the dark countryside. She lay down fully clothed, too wired to sleep, and stared at the ceiling. Downstairs, she could hear James moving around, checking locks and windows again. Across the hall, Emma's door was closed, and Sarah hoped the girl was actually sleeping and not lying awake worrying about tomorrow. This whole situation was impossible and unfair, and Sarah had no idea how it was going to end. But as she finally drifted towards sleep, one thought kept circling through her tired mind. Those men at the airport had found James and Emma once. What would stop them from finding this farmhouse? What would stop them from coming in the middle of the night? And if they did come, what would happen to all of them? Sarah woke suddenly to the sound of breaking glass. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs as she bolted upright in the dark bedroom. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back. The farmhouse, James and Emma, the men at the airport. Another crash echoed from downstairs, followed by heavy footsteps on the old wooden floors. They had been found. Somehow, impossibly, Kozlov's people had tracked them to this hidden safe house. Sarah's hands shook as she grabbed her phone from the nightstand, her mind racing through options. Should she call the police? But James had said Kozlov had people in law enforcement. Should she hide? Should she run? Before she could decide, her bedroom door burst open and James stood there silhouetted against the dim hallway light. His face was pale but determined, and he was holding Emma's hand tightly. The girl looked terrified, her eyes wide and glassy with fear. James put a finger to his lips, signaling for absolute silence, then beckoned urgently for Sarah to follow. She scrambled off the bed, grabbing her bag by instinct, and crept toward them on shaking legs. Downstairs, she could hear voices now, low and commanding, speaking in what sounded like Russian. Multiple voices. At least 3 people, maybe more. They were searching the house methodically, opening doors and moving furniture. James led them down the hallway away from the stairs, toward the back of the house where a narrow window looked out over the roof of a small shed. He pushed the window open as quietly as possible, the old hinges creaking softly. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized what he intended. They were going to have to climb out onto the roof and escape that way. It was a 2-story drop to the ground, maybe more. One wrong step and someone could break their neck. But the footsteps were getting closer, heavy boots climbing the stairs now, and there was no other choice. James lifted Emma up to the window first, helping her climb through onto the slanted roof outside. The girl moved with surprising calm, as if she had done this before, and Sarah realized with a sick feeling that she probably had. This was not Emma's first escape in the middle of the night. She had learned to be brave and quiet and quick because her survival had depended on it. Sarah went next, her hands slipping on the old window frame as she pulled herself through. The night air was cold against her skin, and the roof tiles were slick with evening dew. She pressed herself flat against the slope, trying not to look down at the ground far below. James came last, pulling the window closed behind him just as a beam of light swept across the hallway inside. They had seconds, maybe less, before the searchers realized their targets had escaped. James pointed toward the edge of the roof where it met the shed below, then began moving in that direction with careful, precise steps. Emma followed close behind him, and Sarah brought up the rear, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Every sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. The scrape of her shoe against tile, the rustle of her bag against her shoulder, her own ragged breathing. They reached the edge where the farmhouse roof connected to the shed, and James lowered himself down first, finding handholds in the old stone wall. Then he reached up for Emma, guiding her feet to safe spots, murmuring quiet encouragement. Sarah watched them descend with growing dread. She had never been good with heights. Even climbing a ladder made her nervous. But behind her, through the window they had just left, she heard a shout. Someone had discovered the empty bedrooms. Someone knew they had escaped. There was no time for fear anymore. She had to move. Sarah lowered herself over the edge, her fingers finding gaps in the stone where mortar had crumbled away. Her feet scrabbled against the wall, searching desperately for the foothold James had used. For a terrifying moment she thought she was going to fall, but then Emma's small hand grabbed her ankle and guided it to a solid spot. She climbed down inch by inch, her muscles screaming, until finally she felt James's hands on her waist, steadying her as she dropped the last few feet onto the shed roof. They crouched there together, catching their breath, and Sarah saw that Emma was crying silently, tears streaming down her face even though she made no sound. James pulled her close, kissing the top of her head, whispering that she was brave and strong and it would be okay. From inside the farmhouse came more shouts, and then the back door slammed open. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping across the garden and the shed. James grabbed Sarah's hand and Emma's hand, and they ran. They slid down the shed roof and dropped into the overgrown bushes below, thorns catching at their clothes and scratching their skin. They pushed through the undergrowth toward the olive grove beyond the farmhouse, moving as fast as they dared in the darkness. Behind them, more voices joined the search. Car doors slammed. An engine roared to life. James pulled them deeper into the grove, weaving between the gnarled tree trunks, his hand never releasing theirs. They ran until Sarah's lungs burned and her legs felt like rubber. They ran until the sounds of pursuit had faded into the distance. Finally, James stopped in a small clearing and pulled out his phone, the screen's glow illuminating his tense face. He typed something quickly, his thumbs moving with practiced speed, then waited. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the phone buzzed with a response. James read it, nodded grimly, and looked at Sarah and Emma. "We have to keep moving," he said quietly. "I have someone meeting us about 2 kilometers from here. Can you both make it?" Emma nodded, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. She was trying so hard to be strong, and it broke Sarah's heart. Sarah nodded too, though her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. They started walking again, more slowly now but still with purpose. James led them through the olive grove and into an open field beyond, the grass soaked with dew that quickly soaked through their shoes. The moon was bright overhead, providing just enough light to see by, and Sarah found herself grateful for that small mercy. At least they weren't stumbling through pitch blackness. As they walked, Sarah's mind churned with questions. How had Kozlov's people found the farmhouse? Had they been followed from the airport? Had someone betrayed them? And what would have happened if they hadn't woken up in time? The thought made her shudder. Those men had not come to talk. They had broken in during the middle of the night, which meant they intended violence. Sarah thought about the metallic glint she had seen on the airplane, about James reaching into his seat pocket. Had he been carrying a weapon? Did he still have it now? They reached a narrow country road and followed it north, staying in the shadows of the trees that lined the pavement. Twice they heard cars approaching and had to hide in the bushes until the vehicles passed. Sarah couldn't tell if they were searchers or just ordinary people driving home late, but James wasn't taking chances. Everything was a potential threat now. Everything could be danger in disguise. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they saw headlights approaching slowly from the north. James tensed, his hand moving to his pocket, but then he relaxed slightly as the vehicle came into view. It was an old delivery van, white paint faded to a dingy gray, with French words painted on the side that Sarah couldn't read in the darkness. The van pulled to a stop beside them, and the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out, and Sarah blinked in surprise. She had expected another man in a dark suit, but this was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a fleece jacket. She looked like someone's grandmother, not someone involved in helping fugitives escape in the middle of the night. "James," the woman said in accented English, her voice warm but urgent. "Get in quickly. They are searching all the roads. I passed 3 checkpoints on the way here." James ushered Emma and Sarah into the back of the van, then climbed in after them, pulling the doors shut. The back was set up like a small camper with a narrow bench seat, some storage compartments, and blankets piled in the corner. It smelled like old coffee and diesel fuel. The woman got back in the driver's seat and pulled away immediately, not turning on the headlights until they had gone around a curve and were out of sight of where they had been standing. "Sarah, this is Marie," James said. "An old friend who has helped us before. Marie, this is Sarah Chin. She got caught up in our situation by accident and is now in as much danger as we are." Marie glanced back at them through the rearview mirror, her eyes kind but worried. "I heard what happened at the airport. Word spreads quickly in certain circles. Kozlov is offering a reward for information about your location. 2 million euros. That is enough money to tempt even good people to do bad things." She navigated a turn expertly, the van swaying slightly. "I am taking you to a place I know. A monastery in the mountains. The monks there do not ask questions, and they do not speak to outsiders. You will be safe there for a few days while we make arrangements for more permanent solutions." Sarah sat on the bench seat next to Emma, trying to process everything. A monastery? 2 million euro reward? This was spiraling further and further into territory that felt more like a movie than real life. Emma leaned against her, exhausted, and Sarah put her arm around the girl instinctively. She could feel Emma trembling, the adrenaline and fear finally catching up to her now that they were momentarily safe. James sat across from them, his face drawn and exhausted in the dim light that filtered in from the front of the van. "How did they find the farmhouse?" he asked Marie. "I was so careful. I paid cash, used fake names, never told anyone about that location." "Technology," Marie said simply. "They are using satellite imaging, cross-referencing with property records, looking for places that fit certain patterns. Isolated locations, recently purchased, stocked with supplies but no obvious occupants. It is sophisticated and expensive, but Kozlov has both sophistication and money." She paused. "You cannot keep running like this, James. Eventually they will find you no matter where you hide. You need a different solution." "I'm open to suggestions," James said bitterly, "because I'm running out of ideas and safe houses." They drove in silence for a while, the van climbing steadily into the hills. Sarah watched the landscape change outside the small windows, the flat countryside giving way to steeper terrain with rocky outcroppings and pine forests. The air grew cooler as they gained elevation, and she could see her breath fogging in the unheated back of the van. Emma had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted from the terror and the running. Sarah envied the girl's ability to find rest even in circumstances like these. Her own mind was too wired, too full of fear and questions and the memory of those heavy footsteps in the farmhouse. After nearly 2 hours of driving on increasingly narrow and winding roads, Marie finally turned down an unmarked dirt track. They bounced along for another 10 minutes until buildings appeared ahead, dark shapes against the starlit sky. It was a cluster of stone structures built into the mountainside, ancient and weathered but solid. A monastery, just as Marie had promised. She parked the van behind one of the larger buildings and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. "Wait here," Marie said. "I will speak to Brother Philippe. He is expecting us." She disappeared into the darkness, and Sarah sat in the back of the van with Emma sleeping against her and James staring at nothing across from her. The weight of what had happened tonight pressed down on all of them. They had almost been caught. If Sarah hadn't woken when she did, if James hadn't moved so quickly, they might be in the hands of Kozlov's people right now. The thought made her feel sick. "Thank you," James said suddenly, his voice quiet so as not to wake Emma. "For staying with us. For not panicking. For helping to keep Emma calm. You didn't have to do any of that." "Where else was I going to go?" Sarah asked with a weak smile. "I'm pretty sure those men would have grabbed me too if they'd found me in that bedroom." "Probably," James admitted. "I'm sorry. This is all my fault. I should have been more careful at the airport. I should have spotted the surveillance. I should have protected you both better." "You got us out," Sarah pointed out. "We're alive. We're safe, at least for now. That counts for something." James nodded slowly, but she could see the guilt eating at him. This was a man who was used to being in control, used to solving problems with intelligence and resources, and now he was trapped in a situation where all his money and brilliance couldn't guarantee his daughter's safety. It was destroying him slowly. Sarah could see that. The fear and the constant running were wearing him down piece by piece. Marie returned after a few minutes with an elderly man in a simple brown robe. Brother Philippe had a weathered face and kind eyes, and he gestured for them to follow him without speaking. James carefully lifted Emma, who stirred but didn't wake, and they followed the monk through a heavy wooden door into the monastery. Inside was a simple hallway lit by candles in wall sconces, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. Their footsteps echoed softly as Brother Philippe led them up a narrow staircase to a small room with 3 beds. He spoke in French to Marie, who translated. "He says you are welcome to stay as long as you need. Breakfast is at dawn. There is water for washing through that door. He asks only that you respect the silence of the monastery during prayer hours." She paused. "And he says that God protects those who seek refuge in his house. You are safe here." Sarah wasn't particularly religious, but standing in that simple room with its plain wooden beds and single cross on the wall, she found herself hoping that Brother Philippe was right. They needed all the protection they could get, divine or otherwise. James laid Emma on one of the beds and covered her with a blanket, then turned to Sarah and Marie. "What happens now?" he asked. Marie's expression was grave. "Now we find a way to end this. Because running is not working anymore, James. Kozlov is too determined, too well-funded. You need to go on the offensive instead of the defensive. You need to find a way to make him back off permanently, or this will never end." "And how do I do that?" James asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be simple. "That," Marie said, "is what we need to figure out. But for tonight, you rest. Tomorrow we plan, and then we find a way to give you and Emma your lives back." She left with Brother Philippe, and Sarah and James were alone with the sleeping Emma. Sarah sat on one of the beds, suddenly so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. James sat on the 3rd bed, his head in his hands, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Outside the small window, dawn was beginning to break over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day was beginning, and with it, Sarah hoped, would come answers. Because Marie was right. They couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, something had to change. Eventually, they would have to stand and fight. And Sarah had no idea if any of them would survive when that moment came. Thank you for watching. If you found this story engaging, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective adds value to the conversation. To stay updated with future stories exploring themes of race, inequality, and the unexpected choices that shape lives, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful and thought-provoking content.